You've been practicing verb conjugation for a while now, but you'll occasionally encounter some verbs that, for one reason or another, can't quite follow the rules the same way other verbs do. Specifically, we'll be talking today about some verbs whose stems are just plain incompatible with certain conjugation endings, and what we can do to make those conjugation endings fit anyway. An analogy for this in English might be what we do when we want to make words that end in Y plural, like turning baby to babies. We can't put an S on a Y, so we slightly alter the spelling of the word in its plural form instead. As you'll soon see, we won't be completely reinventing the system of conjugating verbs. We'll just be making some slight changes to get certain types of stems and endings to fit together. First of all, let's refresh our memories by looking at a verb that is conjugated normally. To conjugate, as you'll recall, we need to first remove the en ending from the infinitive form, which leaves us with what's known as the verb's stem. For instance, if we took the verb singen, we'd remove the en from singen to reveal the stem sing. This stem will be used again and again, and we'll just be adding the correct conjugation endings to it in order to match the various subjects. An I with ich, an ST for du, a T for er, sie, and es, an IN for wir, a T for ihr, and an EN again for sie and sie. So far, so good. Now, if we were to conjugate another verb, theoretically those endings should be exactly the same. However, we're dealing with odd verbs here. So we're going to put these endings in for just a moment, and then theoretically we may need to tweak them depending on what kind of odd verb shows up. First of all, there are verbs out there whose stems end in a s sound. Specifically, their stems might end in the letter S, sz, or z. Küssen would be an example of this type of verb. Its stem, küss, ends with a s sound. Now, looking at those conjugation endings, one of them jumps out as presenting a problem. That st ending that goes with du. We can put that stem küss on all the other conjugation endings. But if we tried to put an st ending on it, we'd have 3 s's in a row, which not only isn't pronounceable but also looks pretty silly. The solution is just to get rid of that extra s in the ending. Du küsst, with only 2 s's, sounds the same anyway, since we already have that s sound on the stem. This will work virtually identical with a verb you're very familiar with, heißen. This one, instead of 2 s's, has an sz, again the s sound. So when we remove the en from that stem, we're going to have to add just a t in the du form instead of the st. All the other forms, though, are normal, just like they were with küssen. Now let's take a look at another type of stem that presents some conjugation problems. Again, theoretically our endings should be ESTT, ENT, and EN, but we'll see if that holds up once we take a look at these verbs. We're going to be looking at verbs whose stem end in ELN instead of just EN. Segeln, which means to sail, is an example of one of these verbs, along with other ones you know like basteln or sammeln. Now right off the bat, step 1 of our conjugation procedure is out the window. We can't remove the en ending from the stem because there just isn't one. There's just an n. What this means is that since we can't chop an en off, we also can't add an en on in the wir form and the sie and sie form when we conjugate this verb. Instead, since we only removed an n, we'll only put an n back on when we conjugate it. Now, there's one more form where this type of verb is a little bit odd. In the ich form. Look carefully at the stem, and you'll notice that the stem ends in el. That e sitting there is just too good to pass up. So instead of adding another e after it, we'll just take that e and put it after the l in the ich form. Ich segle, not segle. We're left with the following verb forms. Ich segle, du segelst, sie es segelt, wir segeln, ihr segelt, sie und sie segeln. And again, the only time the stem actually gets changed is for the ich form. One more type of verb will cause some conjugation problems. Stems with a d, t, or big consonant combination like chen at the end of them. We'll use the verb finden as our first example. Now, with verbs like this, the good news is that the conjugation endings will actually just be normal. But, as you'll see in a minute, we're going to need to do something to get them to actually stick to the stem. Take a look at the verb finden. Its stem, find, ends in a d, and if we just added the endings to that as usual, the ich form and the wir and sie forms would be okay. But st and t endings aren't going to work. It's difficult, if not impossible, to say those endings on that stem. Try saying du findst or findt. It's unpronounceable, and what's the point of adding an ending to a verb if you're not going to be able to pronounce it? The solution is to add an adapter before the ending, the letter e, basically as a filler vowel to get that ending to be pronounceable. Now we have findest and findet, which are much easier to say. The same concept would apply with a different verb, such as zeichnen, which means to draw. We'll need that e adapter to get the st and t endings on the verb correctly, because zeichnst and zeichnet are impossible to say. Zeichnest and zeichnet are pronounceable. Let's review. When conjugating a verb, if the verb stem ends in a s sound, so in other words an s, a z, or an sz, then you can only add a t in the do form, not the usual st ending. When verbs end in eln, instead of adding an en where you normally would, you can only add an n, since you didn't remove an en from the infinitive form. And you also remove that e from the stem in the ich form, since you've got an e on the ending. Also, with stems that end in d or t or big consonant combinations like chn, you'll need to add an e between the stem and the endings st and t. What's important to keep in mind here is that you're not completely reinventing the system of verb conjugation with these verbs, you're just making some minor spelling adaptations to get the stems and the endings to fit together a little bit better.